August 16, 1975. Teaneck, New Jersey. 6:47 in the morning. The kind of summer morning that has not yet decided what it is going to be. The air still cool from the night before. The sun just clearing the tree line over the houses on Country Club Road. The suburban quiet of a neighborhood where nothing happens and nothing is supposed to happen. Frank Lucas is asleep. He is 39 years old. He has been running the most sophisticated and most profitable narcotics operation in the history of New York City for 7 years. He has generated, by the most conservative estimates available, over $400 million in revenue. He has outsmarted the Italian families, the NYPD, and every competitor who ever thought they understood what he was building before they understood it well enough to stop it. He has a wife, Julie Ferrate, the Puerto Rican beauty queen from San Juan, who became the most important person in his world, and a house in Teaneck that cost $500,000 in cash, paid in 5 briefcases on a real estate agent's conference table in a transaction so remarkable that the agent, a man named Richard Malone, told someone about it. That conversation, that single, unremarkable act of a man who could not quite keep to himself the most extraordinary thing that had ever happened to him professionally, is the first link in the chain. That ends this morning at 6:47 on Country Club Road. The D arrives at Frank Lucas's front door with a warrant, a tactical team, and 7 years of accumulated intelligence that they have been building since the first time blue magic appeared on Harlem streets, and they could not figure out where it was coming from or how it was getting there. Frank Lucas opens the door in his pajamas. He looks at the agents on his doorstep. He does not run. He does not reach for a weapon. He does not do any of the things that the DEA's tactical briefings had suggested a man of his resources and his reputation might do when cornered. He looks at them with the expression of a man who has known for some time that this morning was coming, and who has spent that time preparing for what comes after it. He steps back from the door. He lets them in. And what Frank Lucas does in the hours and days and months that follow his arrest, the specific decisions he makes, the specific information he provides, the specific way he turns the most catastrophic moment of his life into the most consequential act of his career, is the story that nobody tells. When they tell the story of Frank Lucas, this is that story. To understand what Frank Lucas did after his arrest, you have to understand what he was arrested with. Not just the charges, though the charges were serious: conspiracy to distribute narcotics, tax evasion, and a collection of related federal offenses that carried potential sentences measured in decades. What Frank Lucas was arrested with was something more significant than the charges. He was arrested with knowledge. 7 years of it. 7 years of running an operation so deeply embedded in the institutional infrastructure of New York City, so thoroughly intertwined with the law enforcement agencies that were theoretically trying to stop it, that the knowledge Frank Lucas carried in his head was, by any reasonable assessment, the most valuable intelligence asset in the history of federal narcotics enforcement in the northeastern United States. Frank Lucas knew names. He knew not just the names of dealers and distributors and street operators. That kind of knowledge was useful, but not extraordinary, the kind of thing that any major narcotics arrest produced. He knew the names of police officers, not just a few dozens. Officers at every level of the NYPD hierarchy, from patrol officers who looked the other way to detectives who actively tipped off Frank's operation when raids were being planned, to supervisors who managed entire units while simultaneously managing their arrangements with Frank's organization. He knew the names of D agents, federal agents, the people whose institutional purpose was the enforcement of the exact laws that Frank Lucas had been violating for 7 years, who had been on Frank's payroll, who had been providing him with intelligence about federal investigations, who had been actively subverting the enforcement efforts of their own agency in exchange for the specific kind of payment that Frank Lucas had always found to be the most reliable form of security. He knew the names of politicians, local officials who had understood, with the pragmatic clarity that political survival in certain New York neighborhoods required, that Frank Lucas's operation was a force to be accommodated rather than confronted, and who had made their accommodations in forms that Frank could document. He knew the names of judges. Not many judges were more carefully insulated from direct contact with the operations they nominally oversaw, but some, the specific judges whose decisions in specific cases had been preceded by specific conversations that Frank or his representatives had participated in. All of this knowledge accumulated over 7 years of running an operation whose survival depended on maintaining functional relationships with the institutional infrastructure of the city it operated in, was sitting inside Frank Lucas's head on the morning of August 16, 1975, when the D knocked on his door in Teaneck, New Jersey. And Frank Lucas, who had spent 7 years demonstrating that he understood the structure of power better than almost anyone in New York, understood immediately what that knowledge was worth. Not to him personally, to the federal prosecutors who were going to be sitting across from him in the days and weeks that followed, and to the story of how Frank Lucas survived what should have been the end of everything. The federal prosecution of Frank Lucas began in the fall of 1975 and proceeded with the specific efficiency of a case built on 7 years of accumulated evidence. The D had not found Frank Lucas by accident. They had been building their case methodically, following the money and the product through layers of operational security that Frank had constructed with genuine care. The Richard Malone conversation, the real estate agent who could not keep quiet about the 5 briefcases of cash, had been one thread. The Vietnam coffin operation, when elements of it began to unravel through military investigations that had nothing directly to do with Frank, had been another. The sheer scale of Blue Magic's presence in the New York market, the volume, the consistency, the specific quality that made it identifiable as a product coming from a single coordinated source, had been a third. The D had been pulling on all 3 threads simultaneously for years, and by August 1975, they had pulled enough to make the arrest. What they had not fully understood when they arrived at Frank's door was the scope of what they were actually looking at. They knew they had one of the major narcotics operators in the city. They did not know they had someone who could take down a significant portion of the law enforcement apparatus that was supposed to be their institutional allies. Frank Lucas understood this before the DD. He understood it in the specific and practical way that a man understands things when he has been building and maintaining a system for 7 years and knows every component of that system from the inside. He also understood something else, something that the criminal defense lawyers who eventually represented him and the federal prosecutors who negotiated with him both remarked on in their later accounts of the case. Frank Lucas was not afraid. Not in the way that most people in his situation were afraid, not with the particular paralysis of a man confronting consequences that he had been trying to outrun and has finally failed to outrun. He was afraid in a different way, the way a man is afraid when he has lived for a long time in a world where fear is just information, where it tells you what you need to know and what you need to do, without overriding your ability to think clearly about either. He was afraid, and he was calculating. He had been doing both simultaneously his entire adult life. He continued doing both. The first lawyer Frank Lucas spoke to after his arrest was a man named David Breen, who had been on retainer for exactly this scenario. Frank had known, with the pragmatic certainty of a man who built things that were eventually taken apart, that this morning was coming. He had planned for it, not with a specific date, Nobody knew the specific date, but with the general understanding that 7 years was a long run for an operation of this kind in this city, and that the question was not whether it would end, but how, and what would happen after. What Frank told Breen in their first conversation was not a protestation of innocence. It was not a plan to fight the charges. It was a question, the same kind of question that Frank Lucas always asked when he sat with a situation and looked at it not as something to accept, but as something to redesign. He asked, "What do I have that they want more than they want to convict me?" The answer, which Frank had already worked out before he asked it, was everything. And the negotiation that followed, the months of careful, strategic, methodically executed cooperation between Frank Lucas and the federal prosecutors who were building their case against him, was the most significant and most consequential decision Frank Lucas ever made. More significant in terms of its lasting impact on the institutional landscape of New York City than the shooting on 116th Street. More consequential than Blue Magic, more far-reaching than the Vietnam coffin operation. Because what Frank Lucas did after his arrest did not just end his own case. It restructured the relationship between the narcotics trade and law, enforcement in New York City in ways that are still visible decades later. The cooperation agreement that Frank Lucas reached with federal prosecutors in 1976 was not, by the accounts of the people involved, a simple or straightforward negotiation. Frank was not naive about what he was doing. He understood the moral weight of what was being asked of him, that he was going to provide information that would result in the prosecution and imprisonment of people who had trusted him, who had worked with him, who in some cases had protected him at considerable personal risk. He also understood something that his entire career had been built on understanding, that the moral weight of a decision is a separate question from its strategic logic, and that conflating the two is how men who should know better make decisions that destroy them. The moral question was real. Frank was not indifferent to it. He talked about it in later years with a directness that surprised some of the journalists and documentary filmmakers who interviewed him, acknowledging that what he had done was a form of betrayal, that the code of his world had no word for what he became after his arrest that was not profoundly negative, that the men who went to prison based on his information had not expected that outcome from him and had reason to feel, in whatever prison cells they occupied, that Frank Lucas had violated something fundamental. He acknowledged all of this, and then he explained why he had done it anyway. The explanation was not simple, and it was not self-serving in the way that such explanations often are. It was the explanation of a man who had spent his entire life looking at systems, the system of the Italian families, the system of the narcotics trade, the system of the NYPD and the DEA, and identifying the specific structural features that made them work the way they worked, and the specific vulnerabilities that made them susceptible to disruption. What Frank Lucas identified, sitting in federal custody in 1975 and 1976 and working through the specific calculations of his situation, was that the corruption he had funded and maintained for 7 years was not a feature of the system he had operated in. It was the system. The NYPD officers who had been on his payroll were not aberrations from institutional norms. They were expressions of institutional norms that had developed over decades, and that would continue to develop, with or without Frank Lucas, as long as the underlying conditions that produced them remained in place. The D agents who had been subverting their own agency's investigations were not exceptional cases of individual moral failure. They were the predictable outcome of putting underpaid federal agents in daily contact with the extraordinary sums of money that moved through the narcotics trade and providing them with no structural protection against the temptation that contact produced. Frank had not created this corruption. He had exploited it, And in the specific logic of the negotiation he was conducting with federal prosecutors in 1976, he was now being asked to document it, to name it, to provide, in the form of specific names and specific transactions and specific dates and specific amounts, the evidence that would allow federal prosecutors to prosecute not just the narcotics trade, but the law enforcement corruption that had made the narcotics trade at its scale possible. He agreed, not because he had been broken, not because the federal prosecutors had found some lever of pressure that overwhelmed his resistance. He agreed because he calculated that cooperation was the right move, strategically, practically, and in some deeper sense that Frank was careful about articulating, but that came through in the way he talked about it later. He had spent 7 years operating in a world that was corrupt at its foundation. He had spent 7 years making that corruption more profitable for the people who participated in it. He had spent 7 years being protected by men who were supposed to protect the public and had chosen, instead, to protect Frank Lucas's bottom line. And when the moment came when he could document all of that, when he had the specific and unprecedented opportunity to show, in prosecutable detail, what the system he had operated in actually looked like from the inside, he took it. The information Frank Lucas provided to federal prosecutors between 1976 and his sentencing covered every level of law enforcement corruption he had encountered over 7 years of operation. It covered patrol officers and their specific arrangements. It covered detectives and their specific roles in tipping off raids and protecting distribution routes. It covered supervisors who had managed entire units while simultaneously managing their relationships with Frank's organization. It covered D agents and their specific acts of subversion. It covered the financial flows, the specific amounts, the specific timing, the specific methods of payment that Frank had used to maintain his law enforcement relationships. It was, by the assessment of every federal prosecutor and law enforcement official who reviewed it, the most comprehensive inside account of narcotics-related law enforcement corruption in the history of New York City. More than 100 officers and agents were prosecuted based wholly or substantially on information Frank Lucas provided. The number that became attached to the case in subsequent reporting and documentary treatments, more than 100 convictions, understates the impact, because the prosecutions that resulted from Frank's cooperation did not just put specific individuals in prison. They forced an institutional reckoning with how the NYPD and the D had allowed the conditions that produced those individuals to develop and persist. They produced investigations that went beyond the specific people Frank had named. Because the specific people Frank had named led to other people and other relationships and other arrangements that the investigating agencies had not previously known about. They changed, in ways that are measurable, even at a distance of decades, the internal culture of both agencies. Frank Lucas did not set out to reform the NYPD. He set out to reduce his sentence. He did both. His sentence, which began at 70 years, was reduced to 40 years after his cooperation agreement. He was paroled in 1981 after serving 5 years. He came out of prison in 1981 into a Harlem that had changed in the years. He had been away, changed partly because of what he had built, which had left structural marks on the narcotics trade that persisted after his arrest, and partly because of what he had done after his arrest, which had left structural marks on the law enforcement agencies that policed it. He was 45 years old. He had 38 more years to live. In those 38 years, Frank Lucas did something that very few men who have been where he had been managed to do. He became a story that people wanted to tell, and that he was willing to let them tell on his own terms and with his own perspective included in the telling. He cooperated with journalists. He cooperated with filmmakers. He cooperated with the makers of the 2007 Ridley Scott film that brought his story to the widest audience it had ever reached. He talked about what he had done, the business, The product, the organization, the corruption, the arrest, the cooperation, with a directness that most people who had lived through comparable things found impossible to achieve. He talked about it because he had decided, at some point in the years between his release and his death in 2019, that the story was worth telling completely. Not because it was heroic. He was clear about the fact that it was not. That the harm his operation had caused was real and persistent, and that his personal narrative of brilliant strategy did not cancel or offset that harm. But because the story was true, and because the truth of it, the specific, complicated, morally unresolvable truth of a man who built an empire on corruption, and then dismantled a portion of that corruption through his cooperation, was more interesting and more instructive than the simplified versions that other people told when they told it without him. Frank Lucas was a gangster. He was also, by any honest accounting, the most consequential anti-corruption informant in the history of New York City law enforcement. Both of these things are true simultaneously. The tension between them is not resolvable into a clean verdict. It is the tension that makes the story worth telling. More than 100 police officers and federal agents went to prison because Frank Lucas, after spending 7 years paying them, decided that he was not going to spend the rest of his life paying for what they had cost him. He made the calculation. He made the deal. He walked out of prison in 1981, and the institution he had spent 7 years corrupting was never quite the same. That is not redemption. Frank Lucas would have been the first to say so. It is something more complicated than redemption, and more durable than most things in the world that Frank Lucas had inhabited his entire life. It is consequence. The consequence of a man who understood power, who had understood it since the days of watching Bumpy Johnson navigate a landscape that destroyed most of the men who entered it, understanding it one final time, in a federal holding facility in 1975, at the specific moment when understanding it correctly made the difference between the rest of his life and the end of it. Gangsters react. Legends calculate. Frank Lucas calculated one last time, and New York City is still living with the result. Now, if this story showed you something about Frank Lucas that the movie didn't, if the cooperation, the 100 convictions, the institutional reckoning changed how you see everything he built before it, subscribe right now. Because next week, we go inside the story of the man who spent years hunting Frank Lucas and ended up becoming his lawyer. Richie Roberts, the D agent so honest that his own colleagues hated him, who built the case that put Frank away and then represented him in the appeals that got him out. That relationship makes no sense until you understand both men completely. Turn on notifications. Drop a comment. Was Frank Lucas's cooperation the smartest move he ever made, or was it a betrayal that nothing can justify? Because I have an answer, and it is not the one most people give. The real story is always darker than you think, and the most interesting part is always the part nobody talks about. There is a specific detail about the morning of August 16th, 1975, that most tellings. Of the Frank Lucas story, either omit or mention only in passing, but that matters enormously for understanding everything that came after it. When the D agents arrived at Frank Lucas's house in Teaneck, they expected resistance. Not necessarily physical resistance. They were a trained tactical team, and they had planned for multiple scenarios, but the kind of resistance that takes legal and psychological forms. The refusal to cooperate, the immediate assertion of rights, the demand for lawyers, the stone-faced silence that is the universal first response of experienced operators when law enforcement appears at their door. They did not get it. Frank Lucas opened the door, assessed the situation in the way that a man who has been assessing situations his entire life assesses a situation, and made a decision in approximately 30 seconds. He was going to cooperate. Not completely, not immediately, not without negotiation. He was not naive about what cooperation meant and what it cost. And he was not going to simply hand over everything he knew to people who had not yet offered him anything in return. But he was going to cooperate. He had already decided this before the agents arrived. Not because he had anticipated this specific morning on this specific date, but because he had thought through the scenario carefully enough in the years of his operation that he knew what his response would be when it came. This is the thing about Frank Lucas that most people miss when they focus on the drama of the arrest and the cooperation and the 100 convictions. The cooperation was not a response to the arrest. It was a decision that preceded the arrest, a decision that Frank Lucas had made. In the abstract, in the same quiet office in Harlem where he had made the decision to go to Thailand, where he had made the decision about what to do about Tango, where he had made every significant decision of his operational life. The specific form of the cooperation, the names, the amounts, the dates, the relationships, those details emerged in the negotiations that followed the arrest. But the fundamental choice, the choice to cooperate rather than fight, was made before the agents knocked on the door. This matters because it reveals something about how Frank Lucas thought that the more dramatic elements of his story tend to obscure. He was not a man who reacted to situations. He was a man who anticipated them and prepared for them and made his decisions before they were required, rather than in the heat of the moment when they became unavoidable. The cooperation was Nellie Bell applied to the DE, the same patient observation, the same careful mapping of the landscape, the same identification of the structural feature that made a specific approach not just possible, but optimal. Frank had observed the federal prosecution system the way he had observed Tango's routine. He had learned its patterns. He had identified what it wanted and what it was willing to give in exchange for what it wanted. And he had decided, long before August 16, 1975, that when the time came, the right move was to give them what they wanted in exchange for what he needed. What he needed was his life back. What they wanted was more valuable than Frank Lucas. They wanted the system that had allowed Frank Lucas to operate for 7 years at the scale he had operated. They wanted the names. They wanted the documentation. They wanted the specific, prosecutable evidence of institutional corruption that would allow them to do something that federal law, enforcement in New York, had been trying and failing to do for decades: prosecute the corruption itself rather than just the criminals, the corruption protected. Frank gave it to them, and the specific way he gave it to them, methodically, completely, with the organizational rigor of a man who had spent 7 years managing complex multi-party relationships and understood how to present information in ways that could be acted on, produced results that exceeded what the federal prosecutors had expected when they began the negotiation. They had expected names and transactions. They got names and transactions and the organizational chart of law enforcement. Corruption in New York City, as Frank Lucas had experienced it from the inside. They got the chain of command, such as it was. They got the specific mechanisms how payments were made, through whom, in what amounts, on what schedule, with what protections built in on both sides. They got the internal logic of the system, which is the thing that turns individual prosecutions into institutional reform. You can prosecute a corrupt officer and replace him with a clean one, and the corruption continues if the conditions that produced the corrupt officer remain in place. You can reform the conditions if you understand the system well enough to identify what needs to change. Frank Lucas gave federal prosecutors the understanding they needed, not because he cared about institutional reform. He was frank, in his later years, about the fact that institutional reform had not been his motivation. His motivation was his sentence. But the consequence of his cooperation was institutional reform, whether or not that was what he was aiming for. The consequence is what matters. Frank Lucas also cooperated, in a different way and with a different set of people, in the years after his release. He cooperated with journalists who were trying to understand what had happened in Harlem between 1968 and 1975. He cooperated with documentary filmmakers who were trying to capture the period for audiences who had not lived through it. He cooperated with the makers of the Ridley Scott film, which took his story and made it accessible to audiences who had never heard of Frank Lucas and who, after seeing Denzel Washington's portrayal, wanted to know more. He was not uncritical of these productions. He had specific objections to specific elements of the film, to the way it compressed and dramatized events, to the decisions it made about which parts of the story to emphasize and which to minimize. He expressed those objections publicly and with the directness that had characterized his self-presentation since his release. But he cooperated. He gave interviews. He allowed his story to be told imperfectly by people who had not lived it, because he had decided that having the story told imperfectly was better than having it not told at all. This, too, was a calculated decision. Frank Lucas understood that the story of what he had built and what he had then dismantled through his cooperation had value beyond his personal narrative. Not sentimental value, not the value of a cautionary tale or an inspiration or any of the other interpretive frames that people applied to it from the outside. Practical value. The value of a specific, documented, first-hand account of how power actually worked in a specific place at a specific time, of what the relationship between the narcotics trade and law enforcement in New York City looked like from the inside, by the person who had been most deeply inside it. That account was worth preserving. Frank Lucas preserved it. Not perfectly, not without self-interest, not without the specific distortions that any first-hand account carries, but comprehensively enough that the journalists and filmmakers and historians who came after him had something real to work with. The 100 convictions that resulted from Frank's cooperation were the most visible and most immediately consequential outcome of his decision to cooperate. But they were not the only outcome. The institutional changes that followed, the investigations that went beyond the specific individuals Frank named, the policy reforms that followed those investigations, the cultural shifts within the NYPD and the DE that the prosecutions catalyzed were also outcomes. Less visible, less dramatic, less easily attributed to Frank Lucas's specific decisions, but real. And the documentation, the interviews and the testimony and the specific, detailed account of 7 years of operation that Frank provided to journalists and filmmakers and federal prosecutors was also an outcome. The account of what happened in Harlem between 1968 and 1975, as seen from the inside by the person who built it, is more complete because Frank Lucas decided to cooperate with the people who wanted to tell it. That is not the legacy Frank Lucas would have designed for himself in 1968 when he crossed 116th Street with 4 bullets and a plan and announced to Harlem that a new king had arrived. But it is the legacy he built, not despite the cooperation, but through it. The same quality of mind that produced Blue Magic and the Nagua Recorder and the Vietnam Coffin operation produced in 1975 and 1976. The decision to cooperate with federal prosecutors and provide them with the most comprehensive inside account of law enforcement corruption in New York City history. The same patient calculation, the same structural thinking, the same willingness to look at a situation that everyone else accepted as fixed and ask whether it actually had to be that way. In 1968, the question was, why does the supply chain have to go through the Italian families? The answer was Blue Magic. In 1975, the question was, what do I have that they want more than a conviction? The answer was cooperation. Different questions. The same mind. And Harlem, and the NYPD, and the D and the federal courts of the Southern District of New York are still living with both answers. The specific officers and agents who were prosecuted as a result of Frank Lucas's cooperation represent one of the most significant anti-corruption operations in the history of American law enforcement. More than 100 individuals, the number varies slightly, depending on which prosecutions are counted and how cooperation is attributed, across multiple cases, were convicted of crimes ranging from accepting bribes to actively subverting federal drug investigations to participating directly in narcotics distribution. The range of people implicated by Frank's information covered every level of the institutional hierarchy. At the street level, there were patrol officers who had accepted payments to look away from specific corners and specific operations, not large amounts of money by the standards of what Frank's operation generated, but consistent and reliable amounts that created a structural relationship between the officer and the operation he was nominally policing. These officers were the most numerous, and in some ways the least individually significant element of the corruption Frank documented. Their individual contributions to the operations security were real but limited. A patrol officer's ability to protect a narcotics operation is constrained by the geography of his beat and the scope of his authority. Their collective contribution was different. The existence of multiple corrupt officers across multiple precincts created an environment in which Frank's operation could function without the constant disruption that street-level law enforcement would otherwise have caused. They were the foundation of the corruption architecture that Frank had built. Above them were the detectives, the investigators whose specific function within the NYPD was the targeted investigation of narcotics operations, and who, in the cases that Frank's cooperation produced, had been using that function not to investigate Frank's operation, but to protect it. The detective-level corruption that Frank documented was more damaging to the institutional integrity of the NYPD than the patrol officer-level corruption. Not because it was more expensive, the payments were larger, but not dramatically so, but because it was more operationally significant. A corrupt detective in the narcotics division could do things that a corrupt patrol officer could not. He could access investigation files. He could warn Frank's operation when specific individuals were being targeted. He could steer investigations away from Frank's distribution network toward competitors. He could provide Frank with the specific intelligence about pending enforcement actions that allowed the operation to adapt faster than the enforcement could move. Several of the detective-level individuals implicated by Frank's cooperation had been doing exactly these things for years. Their prosecutions, when they came, produced some of the most dramatic moments of the broader case. Career law enforcement officers, men who had dedicated decades to the institutional identity of the NYPD, sitting in federal courtrooms, hearing the specific details of their corruption read into the record by federal prosecutors working from information that Frank Lucas had provided. Above the detectives were the supervisors, and here the Frank Lucas cooperation case begins to raise questions that went beyond the prosecution of specific individuals and into the institutional structure of the NYPD itself. The supervisors implicated by Frank's information had not, in most cases, been directly receiving payments from his operation in the way that the patrol officers and detectives had. Their involvement was more complicated, a combination of deliberate blindness to the corruption of the people they supervised, occasional facilitation of that corruption through their supervisory decisions, and in some cases, active participation in arrangements that benefited them personally while protecting Frank's operation institutionally. The prosecution of supervisors was more difficult than the prosecution of street-level officers. The evidence was less direct, the patterns of behavior more easily explained by reference to legitimate supervisory decisions. the defense arguments more sophisticated. But Frank's cooperation produced enough specific detail about specific supervisor conduct to allow federal prosecutors to build cases that resulted in convictions at levels of the NYPD hierarchy that had previously seemed immune to corruption prosecutions. The D agents implicated by Frank's information were a separate and in some ways more disturbing category. The NYPD corruption that Frank documented was serious and institutionally damaging. But it operated within a context, the specific history of police-community relations in New York, the specific pressures of policing high-crime neighborhoods with inadequate resources and inadequate oversight that made it, if not excusable, at least comprehensible in the way that systemic failures are comprehensible when you understand the system. The D-agent corruption that Frank documented was different. Federal law enforcement agents are recruited, trained, and positioned differently from local police officers. Their institutional identity is explicitly built around a specific federal mandate, the enforcement of federal narcotics laws, that makes the specific form of corruption Frank documented. D-agents actively subverting federal narcotics investigations in exchange for payments from the operation they were supposed to be investigating. A more direct and more complete betrayal of institutional purpose. Several of the D-agents implicated by Frank's cooperation had been doing exactly this for years. They had access to federal investigation files. They had relationships with other federal agencies that allowed them to provide Frank's operation with intelligence about coordinated enforcement efforts that individual NYPD officers could not have accessed. They operated within a federal institutional context that provided them with a level of protection from oversight that local officers did not have, which meant that their corruption was harder to detect and had been operating longer without discovery. When the prosecutions came, when the federal agents who had been protecting Frank Lucas were themselves sitting across from federal prosecutors working from Frank Lucas's cooperation, the institutional impact on the D was significant enough that it became a reference point in subsequent discussions of federal law enforcement culture that is cited in academic and policy literature on police corruption decades later. All of this, 100+ convictions. The institutional impact on the NYPD and the D. The policy changes that followed was the product of one decision that Frank Lucas made at approximately 30 seconds on the morning of August 16, 1975, when he opened his door and looked at the agents standing on his porch and understood what the right move was. The decision was not easy. The decision was not without cost, moral cost, reputational cost within the world Frank had inhabited, personal cost in the form of relationships that ended, and people who went to prison who had trusted him. He was clear about all of this in his later years, and the clarity was not performative. He was not trying to seem troubled about the cooperation while actually feeling at peace with it. He was genuinely troubled by it in a specific way that a man who has thought carefully about a decision and made it anyway for reasons he can explain is troubled by decisions that cannot be made cleanly. He made it anyway, because the alternative, fighting the prosecution, protecting the men who had protected him, maintaining the silence that the code of his world demanded, was not actually an alternative in the sense of being a path that led somewhere viable. It led to decades in federal prison. It led to the end of everything that was left of what Frank Lucas had built. It led to Frank Lucas at 60, at 70, at 80 in a federal penitentiary, having protected men who were, in many cases, free and living comfortably on the money they had made from their arrangements with his operation. That was not the right move. Frank Lucas knew it was not the right move, the same way he had known that going to Thailand was the right move. The same way he had known that the Niagara recorder was the right move. The same way he had known, on September 12, 1968, that crossing 116th Street was the right move. He calculated. He decided. He executed. And the outcome, more than 100 convictions, an institutional reckoning, 5 years instead of 70, a life after prison instead of a life in prison, was the outcome that the calculation produced. Frank Lucas was released from federal prison on May 5, 1981. He was 45 years old. He had 38 more years to live. In those years he tried, with varying degrees of success, and with the specific difficulty that a man of his history and his reputation faces in navigating legitimate society, to build something different from what he had built before. He was not entirely successful. There were relapses, arrests, periods when the gravity of the world he had come from pulled him back toward it. But he survived. He outlived most of the men he had operated alongside. He outlived many of the men he had helped put in prison. He gave his interviews and told his story, and allowed the film to be made and watched Denzel Washington play him on screen with the specific expression of a man watching an approximation of himself and knowing both what it got right and what it got wrong. He died on May 30th, 2019, in Newark, New Jersey. He was 88 years old. He had been the most feared drug lord in Harlem. He had been the most consequential anti-corruption informant in New York law enforcement history. He had been, throughout, the same man, the same calculating, patient, structurally sophisticated man who had looked at every situation he encountered and asked the question that nobody else was asking, and who had consistently found answers that nobody else had found because nobody else had looked for them in the same places. The question in 1968 was why the supply chain had to go through the Italian families. The answer was blue magic. The question in 1975 was what he had that they wanted more than a conviction. The answer was cooperation. And the answer in both cases was the same answer, expressed in different forms. The world does not have to work the way it works. It is an arrangement. And arrangements can be redesigned by the people who understand them well enough to see what needs to change and who have the specific courage and the specific discipline to change it. Frank Lucas understood this better than almost anyone in the world he inhabited. He used that understanding to build an empire. He used it to dismantle a portion of the corruption that empire had depended on. He used it to survive. And he used it, in the end, to leave behind a story that is still being told because it still has things to say about power and corruption, and the specific way that American cities have always organized themselves around the spaces between what is legal and what is real. There is one more thing that needs to be said about Frank Lucas's cooperation, and it is the thing that is hardest to say cleanly because it does not fit neatly into either the heroic narrative or the condemnatory one. The corruption that Frank Lucas documented and that resulted in more than 100 convictions was real. The officers and agents who went to prison deserved, by any honest assessment, to go to prison. The institutional damage that their corruption had caused, to the communities they were supposed to protect, to the agencies they nominally represented, to the public trust that law enforcement depends on to function, was real and serious and lasting. Frank Lucas's cooperation helped produce accountability for that corruption in a way that the agencies themselves had proven unable or unwilling to produce. This is true. It is also true that Frank Lucas had spent 7 years building and maintaining the system that made that corruption possible. He had recruited the officers. He had established the payment relationships. He had created the incentive structure that turned individuals who might otherwise have maintained their institutional integrity into participants in a criminal enterprise. He had, in the most direct sense possible, corrupted the people he then cooperated with federal prosecutors to prosecute. Both of these things are true. The cooperation that produced 100 convictions and an institutional reckoning was undertaken by the man who had, more than any other single person, made the corruption being prosecuted possible. This is not a paradox that resolves cleanly. It is a paradox that Frank Lucas lived with, in the specific way that a man lives with the unresolvable consequences of the choices he has made for the last 44 years of his life. He talked about it with the directness that characterized his self-presentation throughout his post-prison years. He did not pretend that the cooperation erased the corruption. He did not pretend that the 100 convictions constituted a form of restitution for the harm his operation had caused to the communities where blue magic had moved, to the families it had destroyed, to the people who had died from the product he had brought from Thailand and distributed through Harlem with such organizational efficiency. He acknowledged the harm. He acknowledged his responsibility for it. He also acknowledged that the cooperation was the right move, strategically and in some deeper sense that he was careful about but not evasive about. He had made the decision. He stood behind it. And he spent 44 years being, simultaneously, the man who had built the empire and the man who had helped tear down a piece of the corruption the empire depended on. That is the real Frank Lucas story. Not the shooting on 116th Street, though that is real and important. Not blue magic, though that is the economic foundation of everything. Not the Vietnam coffins, though that is the most audacious logistical achievement in the history of the American drug trade. The real story is the totality, the building and the dismantling, the corruption and the cooperation, the empire and the reckoning. The story of a man who is brilliant and ruthless and strategically sophisticated and genuinely harmful, and, at the end, genuinely consequential in ways that went beyond the harm. That story is harder to tell than the version where Frank Lucas is simply a legend. It is also more true. And the truth of it, the specific, complicated, morally unresolvable truth, is what makes Frank Lucas worth understanding. Not because his life is a model. Not because his choices are anything that anyone should want to replicate. But because the world he navigated and the institutions he exposed and the specific form that his intelligence took, the patient, structural, question-asking intelligence that Bumpy Johnson had, cultivated and Frank Lucas had perfected, tells us something real about how power works and how corruption develops and how the spaces between what is legal and what is real have always organized themselves in American cities. Frank Lucas understood all of this from the inside. He left enough of a record in his cooperation, in his interviews, and the documentary evidence of his operation that we can understand it from the outside. That is the legacy. Not the empire, not the product, the understanding. The 100 convictions were the proof. And New York City is still, in ways both visible and invisible, living with what they revealed. Question that Frank Lucas asked in 1975, "What do I have that they want more than a conviction?" is the same question that every person who has ever cooperated with federal prosecutors has had to answer. Most of them answer it badly or too late or without the full understanding of what they actually possess. Frank Lucas answered it correctly, quickly, and completely. He assessed what he had. He assessed what they wanted. He made the deal that exchanged one for the other on the most favorable terms available. And then he delivered what he had promised with the same organizational competence that had characterized every other significant decision of his operational life. The 100 convictions were not an accident. They were not the byproduct of reluctant and partial cooperation. They were the result of Frank Lucas deciding to cooperate completely, to give the federal prosecutors not just enough to satisfy the legal requirements of the agreement, but everything that the agreement asked for and more. He gave them the names they asked for, and the names they had not known to ask for. He gave them the transactions they could document, and the ones they could not have found without him. He gave them the organizational chart of corruption that they had been trying to build from the outside for years, and that only someone on the inside could have provided. He gave them in the specific form that federal prosecutors needed to build prosecutable cases. 7 years of the most comprehensive inside account of narcotics-related law enforcement corruption in the history of New York. And he received, in exchange, the thing he had calculated was worth more than the 100 convictions it helped produce: 44 more years of life outside a federal prison. Gangsters react. Legends calculate. Frank Lucas calculated to the end. Subscribe now. Next week, the detective who spent years hunting Frank Lucas and ended up becoming his lawyer. Richie Roberts, too honest for his own good. The man who built the case that put Frank away, and the man Frank trusted to help get him out. That story makes no sense until you understand both men completely. Turn on notifications. And drop a comment. Was Frank Lucas's cooperation the smartest move he ever made, or the greatest betrayal in the history of Harlem? The answer is not the one most people give.